with that rather effectively. But the other thing that was very interesting at the Nigel Farage and Suella press conference was there was a question about, what does it say that you've got people, more people now in Reform, ex-Conservative MPs and current Conservative MPs, more people in Reform who've defected than there were, who were in the 2022 Liz Truss cabinet than there are currently in the shadow cabinet of Kemi Badenoch that served in the 2022 Liz Truss cabinet. Now, look, again, I think this is a very unfair characterisation of the Liz Truss period. I think Liz had many of the right ideas. And, the challenge was when she came to execute them was the sequencing and the timing to an extent. It was a bit unlucky with the timing because there was a global sort of confluence of economic events happening with US Federal Reserve sort of interest rate settings that sort of already spooked the markets, and there was an underlying structural problem with a particular class of product that was also sort of just unfolding at that precise moment in time that nobody had really sort of predicted. That was a failure of financial regulation, not political failure. But look, what was happening with that in that period, Nigel Farage put it very well. The other mistake that kind of Liz and Kwesi Kwarteng probably made, and this is something I'd been sort of arguing myself in that summer of 2022, that we needed to be clearer about the need for fiscal reduction, for actual real terms spending cuts. What Nigel said that was very interesting is, the key lesson for him is if you want to do the things she did, if you want to, engage in supply side reform, you've got to make the case for it. But you've also, if you're going to make those big tax cuts at the same time as still wanting to borrow money, you're going to credibly need to show the markets the real terms savings in public spending you're also going to be making to pay for the new things you wanted to do. So in Liz Truss's case, this was the energy price guarantee, which is not something she actually even wanted to do personally. It was something that was kind of viewed at the time as an absolute necessity because of the structural feature of the global energy market and how exposed the UK was because of the bad decisions of previous governments. So Liz, in wanting to pay for that at the same time as doing tax cuts, she and Kwasi weren't at the point of the mini budget serving up corresponding cuts in public spending. And I think that was a very interesting insight from Nigel to kind of make clear that in his view, if he wants to pursue that more economically liberal direction of travel around tax cuts and around deregulation and around, at the same time wanting to invest in some of his priorities around defence and maybe infrastructure, energy infrastructure and so forth in some areas, he's going to have to find and generate significant public service and welfare savings elsewhere. And I totally agree with that. I think that is going to be something Reform will need to spell out in good detail ahead of the general election and get public buy-in for, so that we don't get these kind of manufactured shocks and confected crises around the time of big fiscal events like a budget or an autumn statement or a CSR. You need to seed the ground. You need to prepare the ground. And, Liz was the victim of a range of bad circumstances. The very sad death of the Queen obviously completely disrupted UK politics in that period leading up to the mini budget. Put strange currents into the political airs, and I think it gave her opponents as well, unfortunately, time to think and plan how they were going to undermine her. Well, look, what's done is done as regards the past with Liz Truss. I thought what was really interesting was, Nigel wasn't condemning Liz and he wasn't sort of casting her off. There was a rather nasty question of, will you explicitly ban Liz Truss? And he was quite dignified in saying, look, I'm not going to go down this sort of route of playing questions, but I think it's unlikely that Liz is going to join. She's obviously off doing other things. She's focusing on her new media career on YouTube and so forth. I thought he handled that well. If I was to sort of reflect on another sort of big issue really at the moment for Reform and the Conservatives, the other sort of big feature on the landscape is, realistically, how the parties are going to differentiate from each other on economics. And here, this is where I think reform probably does need to be bolder in terms of setting out some of the taxes that it wants to eliminate upstream earlier. Some of the taxes where, and we, to an extent, we did this in the 2024 general election contract, which is the name for the sort of the manifesto of Reform UK. We did that back then, but obviously, things move forward, and the economic and fiscal context is different, and you can't, hold on to those policies completely. But I think it is right that reform does start to actually set out in clearer detail in the coming months what the main features of a fiscal strategy of a reform government are likely to look like, where it intends to tax and where it intends not to tax in the future. And obviously, linked to that, you also need to start setting out the spending cuts. I think reform are probably better placed to do some of this work, and they're not hidebound by the sort of the legacy of having been in government before that the Conservatives are. They can think a bit more clearly. They have kind of a clearer field to explore all of that. And, it's boldness that wins the day in British politics at the moment. That's the critical insight I would take away from the last few years. When you're prevaricating and sort of not really leaning into what you need to do for fear of polls and focus group findings, ultimately you're losing the political edge and the momentum that you're going to need. Reform probably does need to sort of trust its instincts, lean into that more radical edge, and make the case for the smaller state, make the case for simplified taxes, more predictable taxes in a range of areas, and sort of get away from this conveyor belt that we've had of an ever expanding tax code that's more and more complex with more loopholes. We need lower, simpler, and more predictable taxes, flatter taxes, ideally in some areas, because I think it reduces complexity for businesses and investors, and that's a good thing because you want to make the UK a very attractive business environment. That's how you get growth. That's how you get prosperity and better living standards for everybody over time. So look, yeah, those are just my thoughts really around the sort of the outlook for reform. I do think that the new additions, people like Robert Jenrick and Sue